Hello, my name is Stephen Slight and I'm the DAC Pastoral and Closed Churches Secretary for the Diocese of Lincoln. Welcome to our training session today on fixing the leaks, lowering the bills and helping the planet. Let's start with a virtual pat on the back. Our historic church buildings, by their very nature, are intrinsically green. Many of them have been in use for hundreds of years, and so can't be regarded in any way as a part of the throwaway society. And they are often built of materials which are available locally, so no medieval air miles. In terms of churchyards, it's been calculated that the total area covered by burial grounds in England, and a significant proportion of those are Anglican, cover the same size as a national park. In areas where intensive farming is the order of the day, the churchyard can be a haven for fauna and flora. We are a big player, and by and large, we're doing all right. However, with General Synod's pledge that the Church of England should be carbon neutral by 2030, we need to look again at what we are doing and how we can do it even better. When the diocese's environmental strategy was initially presented to Synod, the very first question asked was about church buildings. As a result of this, the DAC has prepared environmental guidance notes, which are available on the diocesan website, and I'd urge you to have a look at them. Our session today is going to be an overview of these and can't give all of the answers. What we will try and do is give thoughts and suggestions which you can take away and consider in the context of your own church building. We certainly won't be attempting to turn you into eco-warriors. I find it a personal challenge to recycle as much as I possibly can at home. And there's a very sensible reason to turn lights off in rooms which aren't being used. How about an extra bin in the vestry at church for old service sheets or weekly newsletters so that they can be recycled rather than go to landfill? What about turning the vestry light off during the service? If we can do it in our own homes, there's no reason why we can't do it in God's house. Such small changes really do make a difference. There are 3 short presentations today. The session will be recorded so that it can be put on the diocesan website for others to watch who couldn't be with us in person today. After the event, we'll send you via an email a short feedback form so that we can hone our offering for the future and make sure we are answering the questions you really want to pose. We are here to offer further help and assistance after this event and to advise if and when you need permissions, if you are making changes to your church or churchyard. So, without further ado, let's hear from our first speaker.
Thank you. As Stephen says, you are not alone. There are lots of resources to help, including the Lincoln DAC Environment Guidance, which sets out clearly some quick wins, some things that you will need to think about a little more, and what to consider if you're making changes to heating and lighting systems, and several useful links to other resources. We will cover some of the contents of this today, but do read it as it will give you ideas about where to start. The DAC includes various advisors who volunteer their expertise and their time to help you for free. Get in touch early in a project, even when you only have the initial inkling of an idea. Your project will go more smoothly, take less time, and can cost you less if you have involved the DAC from the beginning rather than present them with a final project. They can guide you on all sorts of topics, so do get in contact. The church buildings team also offer surgery sessions on Zoom at the moment, where you can discuss anything church building related, including how to prioritise the recommendations in your quinquennial inspection, how to engage with your wider community and open up the church more often when we are able to again, how to find grant funding, and how to find out more about the history of your church. Sarah will talk more about eco-church and caring for God's acre resources. We can also put you in touch with your deanery environmental champion. Or maybe today will inspire you to become one too. There are also lots of resources available nationally, and I will talk more about the energy footprint tool in a moment. The Church of England has produced a series of environment-related webinars that will give you more detail than we are able to in the time available today. And there are other churches and all of you. And between us, we can share ideas that will mean we can all move further along the path to net zero. So let's now look at energy use. First, look at what energy you are using now and which company it is supplied from. The Church of England has an energy footprint tool, which will help you establish a baseline. It can be found on the online parish return system. Before you start, it is a good idea to gather the utility bills for the previous year, and you can also include the energy use of church halls. Do you know the tariff you are using for electricity? Is that electricity coming from a renewable source? Switching to renewable electricity will reduce the carbon footprint, and there are many suppliers out there. However, before you switch, make sure you are paying the correct level of VAT, 5%, not 20%, and that you are not paying the climate change levy. If you have been, before you switch suppliers, check whether you can have a refund. We will look at heating in more detail on the next slide, but start to consider when you use your heating. Unless the church interior has particular historic fabrics, such as wall paintings, it's not necessary to have them heated with background heat all of the time. If you're thinking of upgrading heating or lighting, will your electricity system be able to cope, or will you need an upgrade from single phase to 3-phase? So now let's consider heating. Remember that the DAC has a heating and lighting advisor who will be happy to discuss the best way forward with you. As I've said, it is always best to work with the DAC from an early stage in any project. We know that on average, over 80% of the energy used by a church is used in heating. In terms of reducing the carbon footprint, heating fueled by renewable energy is better than oil or gas. However, there is no one-size-fits-all solution, and we accept that it's not going to be possible to change all of the heating systems immediately. This is the sort of step to plan for, and if your heating system is coming to the end of its working life, think about how to make the next system greener. Renewable energy generation is sometimes possible on site, but remember that any material change on the outside of the building will require planning permission as well as faculty consent. Photovoltaic panels are possible where they cannot be seen or will not impact on the historic setting of the church or a conservation area. So far, there are a few air source heat pumps in the diocese, but as yet no ground source heat pumps. The pictures here are from Carlton-le-Morland, and the hedge hides the boxes. We know there are some more air source systems working their way through the faculty process at the moment. There is a way to see what's been installed elsewhere in the country via the online faculty system. Turning back to some quick wins. First, keep a track of when the heating is on and consider if it can be programmed to switch off earlier without loss of comfort of people using up the residual heat. Consider how the church is used, by whom and when, and if this changes throughout the year, and how the heating routine can be adapted to suit these seasonal changes. In the majority of cases, Where the building fabric is not going to be harmed by lack of heat or heat variation, look to heat the people and not the building. Most churches have high ceilings and large spaces, and we remember from our physics lessons that heat rises. The use of heated pew runners or cushions, some of which should just have been installed at Leadenham, or under pew heating or panel heaters close to where people are sitting, are potential solutions. If your heating system uses a boiler, make sure that the room it is in is not the warmest place in the church. You can use insulation around the pipes. Also look at the frost setting. At what temperature is your heating kicking in? Does the fabric really need to have a heating boost in the night if the temperature drops below 10 degrees, when it only needs to kick in at 4 degrees? Check whether the radiators are getting hot. For some systems, it might be necessary to remove air or the buildup of sludge, and your heating engineer should be able to help with this. But please remember that temporary colour gas heaters should not be used, as the amount of condensation they produce will harm the fabric. So let's think about lighting. What sort of light bulbs are you using? Switching to LED lights will drastically reduce your energy use and therefore will also reduce your carbon footprint and your bills. It will also reduce your maintenance costs as LED lights last a lot longer. Can your system have dimmers? Usually, if the light is dimmed by 10%, you save 10% of energy. The human eye does not notice a 10% reduction in light levels, but your electricity bills will be smaller. Make sure that all parts of the system are compatible. And if your church is floodlit, ensure that the lights are switched off by 11 p.m. And if replacing floodlights, again, try and switch to LED. Unfortunately, it's not always possible to swap bulbs in floodlights in the same way as it is with internal lights. If you are upgrading your floodlights, consider the tone of the light and the impact on bats and other wildlife. Can your lights be adapted to have thermal or motion sensors on them? This way, if someone comes in, the light can come on and be welcoming and give enough light to see by for safety, but does not need to be on all of the time. If you're considering a new lighting system, think about what the building is used for and when. For instance, is it necessary to have theatre lighting when you only hold 2 concerts a year? Instead, can your electricity system cope with temporary lights being brought in where needed? Also, consider where in the building people need the light to see by. If your seating is movable, is there sufficient light to see by in all seating layouts? So let's now think about people, one of our biggest assets. Is there someone who can be an environment champion, or can you form a group to assess what changes can be made and take the lead on keeping your church's journey to net zero on track? Can you work towards the various eco-church awards? Can you be a deanery environment champion? Sarah, it will be your first point of contact for this. It might seem odd to think about this in the glorious summer weather we have had, but encourage people to dress appropriately for the age of the building. Think layers and thick socks. I know of some churches that have blankets and hot water bottles at certain times of year. Also, I know as Anglicans, it is tradition to sit near the back, and it is usual to sit in exactly the same place for each service. Persuading people not to sit in their usual place to get out of a draft and to stop complaining might be tricky, but persevere. Can people travel easily on foot or by bicycle? Can you install cycle racks? Consider having a car sharing list. And whilst I appreciate it's not always possible, consider holding services at different times of year in different seasons to make the most of light and solar gain. For other meetings, do they need to be held in a cold church in winter? Can you find somewhere warmer? I'm now going to hand you on to Matthew Godfrey, the Historic Churches Support Officer, for the next part of the presentation.
Great, thanks very much, Fran. My section is maintenance, drainage and drafts. These three elements are closely linked, as I will explain. One, two or all three of them could make a significant difference to your church building, the environment and your carbon footprint, as will become clearer as I go through. But let's start with maintenance. My role is the Historic Churches Support Officer, and a small part of my remit is to keep an eye on QI inspection reports and input them into a database so we have an overall idea of the condition of the churches in the diocese, and also a general idea of the nature, urgency and the costs of repairs. It also helps us to identify parishes which may need a little help with getting some sort of maintenance plan in place, or help with a grant application, or fundraising, or planning a building project, for example. Now, as you will be aware, most of our church buildings have been around for many centuries, which is a testament to their construction and the materials used. All of these materials, with the exception of the newer bits and pieces, are mostly natural materials: wood, stone, slate, or naturally based materials such as ceramic, brick and tile, and lime-based products such as lime, lime mortar, and lime render. Ultimately, all of these materials are biodegradable in time, but saying that, they can last for centuries if cared for and maintained correctly. Indeed, there are a few examples of churches which still possess their original roofs, or at least portions of them, from as early as the 12th century. And the remains of 10th century roof timbers have been discovered here in Lincolnshire in the Anglo-Saxon part of St. Peter, Barton upon Humber, which is shown on the screen now. What these early survivals tell us is that if your church is kept in good condition, we can save the energy and materials needed to repair them. Time, however, is not the chief enemy of our buildings. It's water. It can be harmful to both timber and masonry. Timber that becomes permanently sodden or damp through a blocked downpipe or a leaking gutter, or a parapet gutter that's choked up with leaves and other debris, means the water can spill into the building fabric below, which makes the timber vulnerable to rot. These two slides here just show you a typical example of a blocked hopper head. You can see grass coming out of it, and on the right-hand side of the screen, we've got a blocked or choked up gutter. Either of those could force water to actually overflow from the gutter or from the hopper head into the building fabric and the timber work around them. Now, wet rot damages timbers where the timber moisture content is high. For example, where we've got joist and beam ends, so timber wet rot tends to be localised to wet areas. However, dry rot, or circular lacrimans, to give it its Latin name, is a very different prospect. The spores of dry rot can readily germinate on damp timber in unventilated conditions. For example, a blocked valley gutter with a missing slate or tile where water has leaked into the timbers below, and where there is little or virtually no air circulation. Unlike wet rot, which is what makes this dry rot dangerous, is it has the ability to travel beyond the area of the initial outbreak if the conditions are correct for it. It can even travel along mortar joints and behind plasterwork. It will prosper best around the 23 degrees centigrade or thereabouts. However, it can be stopped if deprived of the correct conditions of damp and poor ventilation. One example here, this is not of dry rot, but this is just to show you an extreme example where slates have come off on the roof here. This is not just the odd slip slate, there's a bigger underlying problem here. But you can see where slates have come off, it's allowed water on the right-hand side of the picture here to actually get to the inside of the walls. That's blown off all the plaster, that's damaged the ornamental cornice. This is a Georgian church with all those Georgian type details. With a Georgian church, the timbers of the roof and the ceiling aren't exposed. So we've got a probably quite a poorly ventilated roof void there, which has damp timbers in it. Those are the ideal conditions where you can get dry rot starting off. And if they happen in a roof like that, that would be quite catastrophic and an expensive fix. The other thing we also need to consider, if water gets into the timber work, is timber with a high moisture content, about 15% or more, is vulnerable to insect attack. So a church with leaks or a condensation problem is not only prone to timber decay from just the water getting in and rot, insect infestation can cause serious damage too. Ultimately, the end result is the same, whether the timber has been weakened by decay or insect damage. It will need replacement and repair, which in the case of a large medieval or Victorian roof, for example, is not going to be a cheap and easy fix. Maintenance then is all about fixing problems when they arise. Refix a slip slate if one comes off. That could cost, say, £150 if done quickly. If left a few years, the seeds of decay can be set in that church roof, timber decay sets in, you could get wet rot, dry rot or insect damage, and that £150 repair could quite easily turn into a considerably more expensive problem. Water can also be a serious problem with masonry too. Walls of most medieval churches consist of an inner and outer skin of stonework with a core of rubble and mortar. Similarly, this construction technique can last for centuries, and the wall core will remain sound, providing the building remains stable, no major cracks occur that let the water in, and that rainwater goods, parapet and valley gutters are well maintained. If, however, water can get into the fabric via one or more of these problems, the wall core can eventually lose its solidity and will start to fall apart. This can be hastened, of course, by a few harsh winters and freeze-thaw action. Externally, a wall that is wetter than it should be is easily identified by flora externally, and inside it will be evident from green algae, crumbling plaster, blistering paint, and possibly a sort of tide mark, but more of that in a moment. Here on these two illustrations, or these two pictures, the one on the left here, you can see we've got buddleia and various other plants growing up from the masonry. The problem there is the blocked hopper head and the parapet gutter behind it has saturated this masonry to allow plants to get established, and that now is soaking the masonry, getting into the wall core, and can cause considerable damage. The picture on the right of the slide, as you look at it, here you can see some ivy growing up the wall. You can also see the difference between the two buttresses. The buttress on the left-hand side, as it were, appears to be drier than that on the right-hand side of the picture. That illustrates the buttress on the right-hand side is being permanently soaked by rainwater goods. And I know you can't, not clearly visible on this picture, but the guttering above that particular buttress, the end cap on the gutter has fell off, allowing the rainwater to spill down the buttress, soaking the masonry and allowing plant life such as ivy to get established. Another example here, this time not plants, but damage caused by water getting into the fabric. If you look at the very left-hand side corner of the tower, you can see here a hopper head and a downpipe, stonework in perfect condition, nothing wrong with it whatsoever. However, the closest downpipe, if you see what I mean, to us on the right-hand side of the tower, you can see we've got the same arrangement, a hopper head and a downpipe, but this time the stonework around that downpipe is in very poor condition. Now, what has happened here is that hopper head has been blocked up for a number of years and hasn't been maintained. That has allowed water to get into the building fabric of that tower. That water, and in a few hard winters, freeze-thaw action on the surface of that stone, because it's saturated, the frost can get into it. You can see it's blown off the ashlar or the smooth face of the stonework, causing considerable damage. Now that stonework will need replacing eventually, a lot sooner than it would have done had it not suffered this sort of damage. So again, that's an easily avoidable problem if that hopper head and downpipe would have been unblocked in a more timely manner. Additional issues we encounter commonly are the well-meaning repairs that have been carried out over the last 50 years or so, using inappropriate materials. Now, traditional building materials are almost always constructed with lime mortar, and in some cases, earth and mortar. Yes, literally earth and lime. In a church context, this is more normal within the actual wall core, the earth mortar. Usually it's lime mortar on the weathering faces of any wall because it weathers better. However, in more recent decades, repairs and repointing have been undertaken in cement-based mortars, which are harder and nowhere near as breathable as lime mortar. This has a number of consequences for natural stone walling. Firstly, the mortar is harder than the stone around it, meaning that the stone weathers back rather than the mortar. Lime mortar, in a traditional sense, is sacrificial. The lime mortar is softer than the stone it surrounds, so that weathers back, meaning that eventually you'll have to repoint it, but the stone does last longer. If you use cement mortar, the cement mortar being harder than the stone weathers backwards, as you can see here on the right-hand side picture. And what's happened there, because that cement mortar has not allowed that stone to breathe properly, the edges of that stone stay rather wet most of the time, and over a few winters and a few years, that weathers the stone much faster than it need have done. The other thing we get with cement mortar is the fact that, unlike lime mortar allows for a little bit of movement and a little bit of expansion and contraction of the building. There's always a bit of natural movement with a traditionally constructed building. Lime mortar allows for that movement, it doesn't crack. However, cement mortar will crack. If you get a crack, we go back to the same problem I've just mentioned. With a crack there, water can actually get in the fabric, especially if it's anywhere near a leaking downpipe, etc. So it can hasten problems within that masonry fabric. Another problem we find with church buildings is dampness at the base of walls. Everybody will be familiar with this in your church. There's bound to be one area or another where you've got this problem, unless you've got a relatively new building. It used to be called rising damp. However, this is not a term we used in conservation now. And it's probably one of the most misdiagnosed aspects of historic buildings, church buildings. And there are usually a range of causes. Sometimes it can be this sort of damp at the base of the walls, but there are other things which I'll go on to explain. Now, this low-level dampness in the low-level walls is not a unique problem to churches. All historic buildings suffer from it, but what is unique to churches is the fact they're in a churchyard, and being in a churchyard means that the ground levels can vary. Now, this wasn't a problem until, say, about the 14th century, when most churchyards by then, because of the rising population, would have started to become rather full. The way to get around this would have been to expand the churchyard and then continue the graveyard further out. However, this was not always an option where the church was a bit landlocked by other buildings, roads, or anything else, or rivers, for example. So basically, what the medieval people had to do, the medieval parish had to do, is double dig or over burial in the churchyard. So they had to put one grave over another, and eventually, over the years, this causes the soil levels to rise up against the low level of the wall of the church walling. This means the floor level inside is lower than the ground level outside, meaning that the base of the walls start to get this sort of low level damp coming up. The other thing this causes, this makes the church technically in sort of a hollow. If the ground levels around the church are higher than the church building itself, that means all the water can pond around the building, which further exacerbates the problem. Now, it's not limited to the medieval period, I'm sure you realise. Churches in urban situations were tended to be hemmed in a bit more by those in the rural areas. Other buildings, roads, rivers, etc., everything I've mentioned previously. This meant that urban churches couldn't expand at all. Again, this means that their churchyard ground levels tend to rise. And there's one example, which is possibly the worst we've ever come across in the records, is that in 1892 at Conway, the soil in the churchyard was observed pressing against the glass of the windows, having risen above the level of their sills. Now, I think we could safely call that a rising damp problem. Now, dampness on interior walls can manifest itself in a number of ways, some of which I've already mentioned. But again, it comes down to maintenance issues and the materials used. Cement, render, and plastic-based emulsion paints, which have been used in churches, cause breathability problems. As I've just mentioned, historic buildings need to breathe. And these breathability problems can mean the damp issues are driven elsewhere in some sort of a tide mark. This can, It can show up as a tide mark, I'll show you in a second. It also can cause crumbling plaster and flaking paintwork. So there's all sorts of things which show that there's an issue going on. Now, a tide mark shows up, as you can see from this picture here, near the banner. That tide mark there is salts on the wall, and they can be easily brushed off. However, that's indicative of a problem. Now, sometimes that can be the fact that the lower base of the wall has been replastered in a cement render, which doesn't allow the wall to breathe. So it pushes the damp upwards to an area where it can come out, where the line render still exists. Similarly, emulsion can cause a similar problem. However, as we've just seen, with a leaking gutter, downpipe or parapet gutter, moisture can also enter the walls from above. Now, as that moisture goes through the wall core and through the building materials, it can pick up dissolved salts. And when those salts appear on the wall surface again, they dry out and causes efflorescence or tide mark. This usually happens where the dampness coming down hits an impermeable barrier. That can be a monument, that can be a door arch, that can be a windowsill, that can be anything such as that. And it shows that kind of salt mark. So it's not always coming from below the damp line, it's sometimes coming from above as well. Another overlooked issue with damp can be through the floor. Church floors in the medieval period were likely to have been compacted earth with clay tiles or ceramic tiles used in certain areas in the chancel, for example. Over time, we get stone flags and we get ledger stones and various other bits and pieces put down. In the Victorian period, we get more glazed tiles put down. Now, what we have to realise is that up to 50% of the moisture content in a church comes through that floor. So it's important we do not block that moisture coming up through. Stop it breathing. We shouldn't stop it breathing. Now, of course, we can't change the floor tiles, we can't change the ledger stones, etc. However, there are things, simple things we can do. Rubber back carpets are a potential problem in a historic church because they stop this moisture movement coming through the floor and can drive the moisture up the adjacent walls and also into the columns and piers within the nave arcades. You can get around this by using a sisal or coir matting, for example. Those sorts of carpets allow the floor to breathe and are very good in churches. Preferably, it's best probably not to have a carpet at all. If you do have a carpet, it will cause problems somewhere along the line anyway, and the carpet itself may become saturated over time. So again, that needs careful monitoring. Essentially, damp, whichever way it shows itself, needs careful diagnosis. And unless it is immediately obvious where the problem lies, good and timely maintenance can get rid of quite a lot of it, in combination with traditional breathable materials and ventilation, the latter of which I'll be looking at shortly. Now, the other issue with water is drainage, of course. Now, we've been looking at the rainwater goods, we're getting the water off the building. However, where does it go then? So, rainwater goods and downpipes are only half the story. You also need to get it away from the building as quickly and as efficiently as possible. This is where storm drainage or below ground drainage is important. And this also needs maintenance. As I'm sure we all know, drainage around historic church buildings can be a bit of a mystery at times. There may be gullies which downpipes drain into, but the mystery is, where do the drains go and where do you flush them through if they suddenly become blocked? If your church is in a town or a more urban location, your church may be connected to the wider street pattern or local drains. However, in a more rural location, where the drains go to is a little bit more questionable. Sometimes, if it's a more modern system, it may be into a soakaway somewhere. Alternatively, the drain pipe may just go into the churchyard and stop there. Whatever way you've got it, the drainage, the idea is to keep it well maintained as you can. Most or a lot of churches have this arrangement, what I've shown here on the slide, this sort of stone or concrete apron around the base of the walls. Now, this is not an ideal situation to start with anyway. This traps moisture at the base of the walls and causes dampness inside, or it can do. However, it's an expensive problem to remove because it would need a new soakaway, new drains, etc., and that's an expensive problem in a churchyard. So we have to make the best of what we've got. So with these stone or concrete gullies, make sure they're clear of debris, make sure they're clear of weeds. If we have got cracks and bits and pieces in them, get your local contractor just to fill the holes up. And if some of the stones or slabs have moved slightly and the water's going the wrong direction, get them leveled up. Make the whole drainage system work as best as it can. Where you've got gullies, for example, in the picture on the right here, if they're blocked up, see if you can unblock them. It won't always be possible, but if they are blocked up, a soup ladle is very good for getting debris out of them. Take the metal grill off in this instance and scoop it out. Again, you can see with this one, there's a few cracks and that the actual sort of rainwater gullies there are actually silted up. So again, those sorts of things, keep them clear. Another problem, which is not so common with our churches, is those which have been provided with a French drain or a similar type arrangement. Not invented by the French, but named after an American called Henry Flagg French, who used them in agriculture in the 19th century. Basically what these are a land drain, fairly close to the walls, with an aggregate on the top. And basically what that allows it to do is the water filters through the aggregate into the land drain and is carried away from the building. That's all fine and well if it's working properly. However, if it's not maintained, silt builds up within the sort of the aggregate or the gravel. That then can block up the land drain, and then basically what you're left with is something which is doing the complete opposite to what it should be. You end up with a French sump as opposed to a French drain. So if you do have French drains around your church, please ensure that they're maintained well, because they will cause a problem if not. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, churches are drafty buildings. They leak air. This is due to their age and the materials used. Now, as we've just discussed, these buildings need to breathe, and these drafts, therefore, are quite important to the health and well-being of the building. But they can be uncomfortable for the people who use it. Now, maintaining ventilation is important, but there can be improvements that can be made, which are not to the detriment of the structure. For church buildings, it's been estimated that between 15 to 20% of heat loss is via drafts. So there are things that can be done. Simple things can be done very easily, such as if you've got a broken quarry in one of the windows, make sure it's fixed, that kind of thing. They're problems easily dealt with. Similarly, if you've got timber doors, if they've got a damaged part of the frame off the weatherboard, or if there's a gap underneath, see if you can do any repairs to doors and frames to improve that position of them, so there's no drafts coming around, or fewer drafts coming around them. That's not as easy if you've got a medieval door with a stone surround, of course. That's more applicable if you've got a sort of a more newer building. Some churches, for instance, use heavy curtains behind the doors to cut down on drafts. I've seen others which use a draft excluder, or one of those sausage dog things behind the doors. These are all very good. However, please make sure if you do use the curtains or those sausage dog type things, make sure they're not in the way of a door which is used as a fire escape when the building is in use. You can use them though if the building has a warm-up period for your heating system, for example. Now, relative humidity is a term I'm sure you're all familiar with. It can play a big part in the health of our church buildings and the comfort of the building users. The physics of it is that warm air can hold more moisture than cold air. This is the basis of cloud formation and why you get condensation on the bathroom mirror when you have a shower. Moisture condenses where warm air meets something cold, and as the air cools, it can no longer carry that moisture and essentially has to put it down. Cold surfaces in churches can be walls, floors, the underside of metal roofs, lead or copper, for instance. But with the correct ventilation, the risks of this condensation can be reduced. However, if the building is already damp through a leaking downpipe or a gutter, or has been repaired with modern non-breathable materials, condensation could be far worse. A damp wall or a building will have a lower insulation value and conduct heat out of the building and cool the interior through evaporation. So a damp building is always going to be a colder building than one which is dry. Also, a relatively high humidity inside the building can make it feel uncomfortable for building users, and at certain times of the year make it feel cooler, increasing heating bills and also increasing the building's carbon footprint. Therefore, good and timely maintenance can lower your church building's carbon footprint by addressing these kind of issues. We also know that high humidity and damp are the primary agencies of decay. So maintenance and breathable materials are important in helping to prevent this, as is ventilation. Ventilation can be done quite easily in the summer months. If the church door can be kept open, for example, you can have a bird mesh in front of the porch, and that allows the air to circulate around the building, dries it out in the drier, warmer weather. One thing I come across in our church quinquennial inspection reports are those hopper type windows, which are shown here on the right hand side of the picture. I always say to parishes, make sure these are working correctly, and in the summertime you can have those all open, and it allows a cross draft, and again it gets that relative humidity down in the building, lets the building breathe and dries it out a bit. They're relatively easy to repair if they are broken. Sometimes all they will need is a bit of oil and a bit of de-rust here and there. Sometimes you'll need to put a bit of mesh on to stop birds coming in, and if these types of windows are higher up, they may need a new cord or a new latch to which to open and close them. But they're quite easy fixes, and again can improve the interior sort of humidity of the building quite easily. They can be a problem, however, in the winter time, especially if you're standing next to one. Now, one easy conservation method to deal with that is to get some black plasticine and press round the metal frame, thus sealing the gap. You can do that in the colder winter months. That stops the drafts. It's completely reversible. Come the warmer spring and summer months, you can take the plasticine off. Nobody would ever know it was there, and you can use the window as intended again. Of course, that position won't work if those windows are in the clerestory. I'm not expecting people to go into the clerestory with a ball of plasticine to do the draft proofing. Keeping the windows open during the warmer months is easy, but in the winter, too much ventilation will mean the building will be impossible to heat. So it's a bit of a balancing act, depending on the frequency of use, weather and temperature. Too little ventilation can mean condensation and mold growth, so each building needs to be considered differently. One final point often overlooked in terms of ventilation are air bricks or wall vents for timber flooring. Now, these are ones you shouldn't block up. If you've got few platforms with these air vents or air bricks going to the outside or air vents to the inside, make sure they're clear, they're not blocked up with debris, and the air can cross underneath. You get a good airflow underneath those timbers. If those timbers don't get airflow, they become damp, and then they're very prone to wet rot and dry rot. So again, keeping the ventilation to subfloors, timber subfloors, will help maintain the building and stop an expensive or nasty repair bill you weren't expecting. Finally, hopefully I've shown you briefly that regular maintenance can help you avoid or at least delay a large repair bill. Regular maintenance will also mean your church is better insulated if the fabric is drier, which in turn will reduce heating bills and reduce the carbon footprint. Now, as you might imagine, there are a number of resources that are available to help, and here are a few examples on the screen, but please do look at our website, as we will have more additional information on there for you to have a look at. Now I'll hand over to Sarah.
Thank you so much. That's so helpful. We are now going to spend a bit of time thinking about the space beyond the church building and what our churchyards can contribute in our caring of creation. So churchyards provide a permanent resting place for our loved ones past and present, and are primarily cared for with this in mind. At the same time, plants, insects and animals deserve our care too, so managing churchyards is not only for people, but is also for the species and creatures living there. So in these slides, we're going to take a moment to think about making the most of our churchyards to both increase biodiversity and reduce our carbon footprints. In the past 90 years, we have lost 97% of wildflower meadows in the UK. Only 3% remain. And churchyards can help to restore this imbalance. The loss of meadow grassland habitats is a crisis for insects, such as the beetles, moths, wild bees and butterflies, who in turn are pollinators, of our flowers and become also food for birds such as the swifts and for insectivores and mammals such as bats, hedgehogs, shrews. So meadows can contain up to 40 species per square metre, and every parish would have had one. In many places, the churchyard is the only one left now. So it has the potential to be like a Noah's Ark, a sanctuary of life, linking to a corridor of roadsides, hedgerows and coverts, all together becoming a naturehood. At the same time, we have a real and present climate crisis, which urges us to change our use of fossil fuels and reduce our carbon footprints. So we can help capture and store carbon through natural means. We know a lot about trees, but also think about our hedgerows and our meadow grasslands, because they too can be part of carbon sequestration. And also we can reduce our carbon footprint with mowing less and returning to scything and seasonal grazing, which currently does happen in some Lincolnshire churchyards. So churchyards and our boundary hedges are not only ecological resources, but they can also be part of the solution in reducing our carbon footprints. So what do we need to bear in mind when we're considering managing churchyards for both people and planet? Well, first of all, the first thing that people kind of think about, I suppose, is the grassland management. And I think the principle here is to keep some grass short, especially around paths and the frequently visited areas of your churchyard. And then gradually, as you move away from those, some mid-length and some long grass areas. So have a management plan. Change your cutting regime so that seeds can set and disperse before cutting later in August or September time. And if you're going to do this, obviously you change your management plan with your contractor and communicate what you're doing and why. So this is not abandoning a churchyard, this is managing a churchyard for biodiversity. And the best one-stop shop is the newly launched resources on the Caring for God's Acre website. There are 4 really helpful action packs. And if I've done one thing today and directed you there and you go and have a good browse, then I've done my job, because they are excellent resources to help us on our way. The other thing you might want to do is go and visit Carlton's group, because the churchyard there has been maintained in a really sensitive way for biodiversity for the last 26 years, and it is a beautiful example of what is possible. The second thing I want to think about is doing a survey, because only when you know what you have do you start to then adapt. It's like when you move into a new house, you let your garden grow to see what you've got before you start making changes. Churchyards are a seed bank of ancient wildflower seeds, but they probably haven't had a chance to grow because of mowing. So letting your grass grow longer lets other plants grow, such as a wild orchid appearing in Ruskington recently as a result of that. So it's really good to get your community involved with this, with a citizens project, finding out what have you got, doing a survey, and there's lots of resources that will help you with this. Or you might want to get an ecologist involved. So you might want to contact Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust, someone like Mark Schofield or Amanda Jenkins. And you never know, your churchyard might qualify and become a local wildlife site. But only then, once you know, do you enrich. And so when you're enriching, don't go and buy cheap wildflower seed packs. You need to source local seed, which is right for the soil type and context. You might want to contact Love Links Plants, who specialise in Lincolnshire wildflowers. You might also want to, we'll send you some links to reputable wildflower sellers seeds in Lincolnshire as well. So remember, log what you have and use something like the National Biodiversity Network Atlas to do so on a national scale. Number 3, lichens, ferns and mosses. They thrive in different levels of sun and shade and on different surfaces, and some churchyard lichens are really rare. So for example, Bournemouth churchyard has a very rare British lichen, and so please don't scrub lichens off or treat them with bleach or chemicals, because that's not going to help anything or any form of life. So our lichens are beautiful and not unsightly. Ferns and mosses also have their right place in the right habitat, particularly boundary walls and dark damp corners, but maybe not on our church walls, as Matt has pointed out, because they are an indication that something else might be wrong. The next point I want to make is our bats. Bats, our stone churches are perfect homes for bats. Bats are a protected species in law, but they are also an indicator species. So if you know that your bats are flourishing, then you know that the local biodiversity management is about right. And obviously the converse is true. If your bats are not flourishing, then your churchyard management isn't right. So your local Lincolnshire bat group really wants to hear from you about how your bat colony is doing. In my own village, I noticed a huge dearth in bats over the last 10 years. So they are under threat, and they need those insects to survive. This summer, Bats in Churches is doing a drive on bat surveys. So usually bat surveys are professionally carried out and you are a licensed bat surveyor, but this is a citizens project, and they will resource you to see if you can do a bat count and see if your bat group is thriving or not. Obviously, our churchyards and churches are also great for birds, mammals and reptiles. So it's not just the grasslands, the eaves of our buildings, the hedgerows and the trees, all of it will support life all the year round, with cover for nests, with food for insects or from insects, and also the important winter berries. You might also want to think about the possibility of bird boxes, particularly for the endangered birds such as swifts, whose population has more than halved since 1995. So hedgerows have an important part to play in this, and rather than having an annual trim, think about a 3-year rotating maintenance plan for your hedgerows. Top one year, side 1 year, other side the other year. Remembering not to cut back during nesting and breeding months, and ideally, I know this sounds high, but ideally keeping it to over 2 meters in height. The height enables more life to be supported. Did you know that by reducing the frequency of cutting your hedgerows from every year to every 3 years, it doubles the number of flowers, which is supports the important pollinator, the pollinators, and it trebles the amount of berries that the hedges produce, and these of course are important for birds. So simple things make big differences. Trees. Value the ones that you've inherited, and often our yew trees, not this one in particular, but often our yew trees are older than the church itself. So if you are hoping to plant new trees, which, you know, in the media we're very much encouraged to plant trees, however, in our churchyards we need to be very careful in our choices, because consider the shadow that will be cast by the future mature tree, and make sure it isn't going to block the light of the important species underneath, so especially our grassland habitats. So check with the DOC first, because always with tree planting, any disturbance on the curtilage needs to be checked out. And ideally, you're going to choose a suitable native variety from UK stock. And this next year and a half, we've got a big celebration around the Queen's Jubilee, the the Queen's green canopy. And you might consider something to be planted on the north or the northeast boundary as a possible location. So a good distance from the church. And that north-northeast boundary means that you're limiting the shadow cast by the tree on the south-facing sunny aspects. The last point I want to make is the one that Fran has already made: involve people. Communication and partnership is key aspect to this work. Here you can see Reverend Rachel Heskins and Bishop David and Mark Schofield from the Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust, and they were at a blessing of the wildflower seeds. Those wildflower seeds have been handpicked by Mark and the ground prepared and scattered, and this was on Easter Sunday at St John in the Ermine, really enriching that place as a potential centre to then spread more wildflower seed in an urban environment. So this is about partnership working. So think both with people in church, but also schools, residential centres, environment groups, botanists, ecologists, enthusiasts, farmers, local businesses, wildflower officers, local council, local conservation groups. All these people are important to be working alongside and working with, because joining the dots is really important. Eco Church is a really helpful tool here in thinking this through together and giving your group direction. So remember, the potential for churchyards is great, not just for all this biodiversity, but also as outdoor spaces in a community's mental health and for their emotional well-being. So I would really encourage you to have a vision about what your churchyard could become. So is it a place of community, linking the past, present and future in God? Is it a place in which just to be aware of God's love? Is it a place of rest and healing and pastoral care? Is it a showcase for the diversity of God's wonderful creation? Is it a space for everyone to come and contemplate and worship amongst nature? You see, there is so much potential. Thank you for listening, and I'll hand back to Stephen.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you all so much for taking the time to be with us today. We hope that you found it helpful and will be able to take something of practical use away with you. Has it inspired you to be an environmental champion for your church or for your deanery? As I said earlier, we're all here after today to offer help and assistance. Where you want to undertake changes to your church building or churchyard, you may need permission, whether that is the permission of the Archdeacon or a faculty. Get in touch with me early and we can work out what's needed. As mentioned at the start, take a look at the DAC's environmental guidance on the website, plus the faith and environment section, where there's lots of information. We'll also make sure that we signpost the national church pages on the path to net zero and Eco Church and the most up-to-date information. Keep your eye on the diocesan website. And once again, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for watching this training video. Do have a look at others in the series, and if you have any questions, please contact us at the Church Buildings team.